Before we begin this episode, a content warning. Father will be discussing topics of an adult nature and speaking frankly about issues touching on the 6th and 9th commandment. While these are important issues and Catholics must be aware of the morality of these topics and not just turn a blind eye to them, this episode would not be suitable for young children, and parents are encouraged to listen to this episode before prudentially judging whether their older children should listen along with them. We'll pause here for a few moments before beginning. Welcome back to the SSPX Podcast. In this 5th installment on our ongoing Digital Danger series, we'll confront one of the most troubling aspects in the digital age, pornography. Although pornographic material has been around for literally thousands of years, never before in human history has it been so widely disseminated and easily available. This industry, which generates tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue, profits off the addictive nature of this imagery while preying on the young. While Catholics are likely familiar with the grave moral issues surrounding this, they may not be fully aware of the psychological, emotional, and spiritual damage that this inflicts. Further, addiction to pornography can have long-lasting social effects, including breaking apart marriages, inhibiting interpersonal relationships, and standing as an impediment to religious or priestly vocations. These and other matters of a sensitive nature will be addressed by Father Jonathan Kopek on this 5th episode of Digital Dangers.
Welcome back, Father. The last episode of Digital Dangers, we talked about impure content. We talked about the dangers of impurity online, and you focused on social media and hinted that this conference, this podcast would be on pornography, which is kind of the big elephant in the room, the thing that theoretically everyone's familiar with, but maybe not the scope or all the implications of that. So to jump right in, can you give a general overview of, to make it clear for everyone, the general principles and the general danger of this, even though most of that's known, but you're going to build on that. So start there.
All right. Well, so first of all, to be clear what we're talking about by the term pornography, we're talking about any sort of content that is sexually explicit and is intentionally such, for the sake of, basically for the sake of sexual excitation. And that could be, but is not limited to, videos and images, because it could also be things like literature, music, etc. So it's that kind of whole world. And you say it's the elephant in the room. It 100% is. It's easily the greatest danger that we can talk about as far as what the digital world brings. When I say the greatest danger, just first and foremostly, we're going to talk about how it affects us and how bad that is. And I mean all of us, because it's something that's now of our culture. But just already it's everywhere. It's very much everywhere. So it's the great, insidious plot of our times. Almost 2/3 of every bit of content that's downloaded every day is explicit material. And that's all across the world. What that means is that, when we talk about pornography, it's not just, bad people here and there. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's working, and a lot of times working together, and they're making more than, last estimate was more than the NBA, the NFL, and all of Hollywood combined every year, which is an unthinkable amount of money. So billions of dollars. And so it's everywhere. Like I said, we mentioned it kind of at the beginning, and we were talking about social media. It's in all the platforms. It's in every Google search. It's built in even to the little apps on a phone, like a texting app and things like that. It's almost impossible if you have connection to the internet to be safe from it, let's say. So perhaps that might surprise some people, hopefully not too many people, but the more we could just get our head around that reality, the better, because now that's going to, push us into, we got to talk about this. We got to realize what it is. Okay. So that's the first thing. It's prevalent. It's very prevalent. The second thing, and kind of just to start with a principle as far as what we're talking about here, is that I really want to make a very strong point and say that pornography is not just a sin. It sounds strange, but what I mean is, cause I think, most people, at least in our circles, just say, okay, well, that's a sin against purity. It's bad. Sure. We get it. But in a sense, it's more than that in a more fundamental sense. So it's first and foremost a neurological problem. So something that affects our brain, something that affects our nervous system, our whole body. And that means that you don't necessarily have to be a bad-willed person to be affected by pornography. All you need is a brain, eyes, a general human nature, and you're already likely to be negatively affected, let's say. I mean, we have the disposition because it's a neurological problem. So it's, an example would be like, okay, taking heavy narcotics, for the sake of escapism or something like that. That's immoral. That's a sin. We get that. But just first and foremostly, you're damaging yourself. If you're taking hard drugs, you're wrecking your brain. Well, same thing here. It's first and foremost a neurological problem. So what I mean by this being a neurological problem is just basically how it ties into and manipulates the beautiful and wonderful design that God created. So God designed our sexual nature fearfully and wonderfully. It's an amazing design. I mean, he designed it in such a way as to firstly, obviously, as we know, to be a source of new souls that are meant to be brought into the world and be brought to heaven. But then also, secondarily, it's created to be a firm bonding and a support for the spouses that are going to be responsible for those souls, for the father and mother. And for such an end, he really made it a special thing. Not only fitting it with unique and intense pleasure, but sexuality goes far beyond that. There's a whole stack of things. Let's say a whole stack of different hormones and nerves and mirroring cells and all these things that work together to create this physical bond between a husband and a wife. But just like what we were saying in the first kind of episodes, that the other aspects of our physiology, our psychology as well, that they are great gifts, but they can be hijacked. Like our ability to make a habit can be hijacked into addiction. Well, when it comes to the current topic, what we're talking about, our sexual nature, most people have heard of things like dopamine, like the basic pleasure hormone, the reward hormone. We talked about that. But what we're talking about here, as far as our human nature in the marital sense, it goes way beyond dopamine. So there's all these, for example, different pleasure-bringing hormones and chemicals: testosterone, oxytocin, vasopressin, different opiates, serotonin. All these things all at once are working together because through God's incredible design, intimacy is literally something that physically binds spouses to each other on a hormonal and even a cellular level, which is amazing if you think about it. Okay, so you take that whole incredible design, and then you put it back in the perspective of pornography. Pornography is the intentional use of that design outside of God's plan, and the conclusions are going to be obvious. The intensity of the pleasure, the manipulation of all the hormones in the nervous system, all of that towards something that's disordered. And now we're going to be talking about devastating results. We're binding on a physical and cellular level with something that is disordered in itself. And what that's going to do to us is going to be really the corruption of what is supposed to be a beautiful reality of the union between a husband and his wife.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's what I mean when I say it's a neurological problem. But okay, so you have the whole design, you have the ability for it to be manipulated. And one of the first conclusions is that pornography is truly addictive in the truest sense of the word. So in the sense of, despite what I want, I'm physically unable to say no to this. That's that's kind of like if we were to just classify addiction here. Despite what I want to say yes or no, it's like I don't have the physical ability to say no to this, and that's simply because of the massive amount of chemicals and physiology involved. And then this immediate neurological streamlining. So go back to, what we were talking about in the first episode with our habits and our the way we can streamline on our neurological pathways and all that. All of that, of course, is being affected here as well. And so every time, something disordered is used for this sake, it streamlines it that much more. The grooves are made deeper in our brain, and we're affected, or, a person can be affected then in a more and more addictive manner, and with such a strong impact on their nervous system and on their physical system, that addiction is very deep and very powerful. And that's just in the very nature of it. some other results then, as far as like how it impacts our system, just our physical system, is that in a sense it's non-erasable, because it's so impacting on our senses that it affects our memory, and again our mirroring cells. So that's mirroring cells is basically this ability that we have in us. It's still something that's being researched, but it's pretty fascinating thing. It's kind of like our basic ability to learn, how to do what someone else does.
Okay.
And so that's very, very active in a child, as they're growing up, but it's also active between adults and then especially between adults in an intimate manner. There's a mirroring of each other. So that's but okay, you apply that to something that's disordered, and now we're intentionally allowing our brain to be manipulated in a disordered way. Then because of this kind of massive influx of chemicals and things like that, what that's doing on the addiction level is that it's reducing someone's pleasure receptors, let's say, increasingly each time. So we understand that when it comes to drugs, every time someone takes a hit, it increases their tolerance to be able to take more, but it increases their dependency on it at the same time. So they need more in order to get that same sort of satisfaction at the end of it. And so in a short time, when it comes to a pornography addiction that can start almost immediately just because of its massive impact, very quickly, even normal pleasurable activities, like listening to music or spending time with friends, those lose they're no longer pleasurable to us, because it's like someone's bar has been set so high on what they need, until the point where nothing else really brings joy. And even to the point where nothing else even brings normality. So it just becomes like this all involved addiction, which is that much more the worse, because it brings with it, just by its very nature, shame. I mean, that can't be escaped. But not just shame, but secrecy. So you have secrecy and shame working together, and the result is, someone that could be hopelessly addicted very quickly, even despite their best will, too ashamed to do anything about it or to change or to ask for help or something like that, but then still, basically allowed to do it because no one can see. It's a secret thing. So you just have this perfect recipe for someone to enter into a disordered addiction and have a very hard time getting out of it. Very hard time getting out of it. But it's worth probably pointing out just right now that, this is all sounding very dire, and it is. It is terrible,
right?
Especially just because of how deeply it affects us and how deep it carves those grooves. And these days, it's I would say probably one of the main causes for breakdowns in relationships. It's because it's like, one spouse, for example, can't get over it, or something's already been too affected in his mind. And we're going to talk about in a second just how, this problem affects the different nature of man and women separately and stuff like that. But also, we have to say, especially when it starts young, which is more likely, and getting into this sort of thing or even becoming addicted to it. If it starts young, it could be really like it could cause an inability for a man to really learn how to love, not only just physically and intimately with his spouse, but to love in a way that's generous and selfless. Because, okay, to move on now from just like this whole neurological thing, that's already damaging enough as it is, and it can render someone powerless. But the problem is it's not just let's say an addiction to drugs. It's worse than that, because it brings with it this moral connotation of selfishness. So it's to intentionally turn towards oneself and manipulate to use something that's disordered, but that should be sacred. That really does things to our will in a really negative way. It creates a lack of foundation for the ability to love generously, selflessly, or to even ever, to think of someone in a different way. So, real quick disclaimer, by the end of this conversation, I hope we're going to say, don't worry, it's not the absolute end.
There are things to be done.
There are things to be done.
Yes.
It's not absolutely hopeless. But it is in some ways. At the same time, we have to be, just be very blunt and honest. The damage that comes with it won't become undamaged. Like it's not going to go away. So you when you were a kid, you might have had an accident and had to get your leg cut off. And that's not the end of your life. You could still learn to have fun and you could still be a successful individual, but that leg's not growing back. You're always going to have that limp. When it comes to something like this, you might always be, or someone that could have ended up in an addiction to pornography when they were far too young. They're gonna limp for the rest of their life, but it's not the end. It's certainly not the end of their salvation.
Yeah.
For sure not. Otherwise, God would be false and grace would be. Yeah, so it's not the end, but that limp's going to be there, and that's why it is terrifying. So, like I said, it's a common source of breakdowns between relationships. Furthermore, let's say if an addiction to pornography it's a real thing, that in itself is an impediment to a religious vocation. Like it's like your chances are wrecked if there's already something that could be so damaged, like just on the neurological level, something that you can't control. Such a person can't, prudently pursue a religious vocation. And obviously that's something that could be, case by case or whatever talked about. But generally speaking, that's going to be a realization. So something that should terrify us, something that should be like, wow.
Well, I mean, in general, just maybe to clarify one thing you said, and at the beginning you said, this is firstly a neurological problem. And I think, clarify, but you don't mean firstly on the moral level, but firstly in time and affects naturally.
Firstly in time and affects naturally, because as far as the moral choice goes, it could be a very intentional grave sin.
Sure.
It could be a complete accident, and then there's a moral choice that has to be made after that. But the reason I say it in the words of first and foremost a neurological problem is because when we're going to get to, we will talk about, okay, what do we do about this? Let's say like if someone's, stuck in this situation, for Catholics, our response is I need to pray more, I got to try harder. I'm going to, go to the sacraments more often. And all those things are absolutely necessary. And yet if you're battling a drug addiction and you want to stop, if you still have substances in your sock drawer, it doesn't matter how many rosaries you're praying. This is first and foremost.
So the analogy is if you've got phantasms in the mememory from
not just phantasms in the memory, but access to the drugs, so to speak. So that that's why I want to make that point very strongly, both because it needs to give us a reason to have hope. This isn't just a my soul is corrupt thing or this person that I know. It's something that manipulates our nature in a very powerful way that we are all susceptible to. But then also we got to be practical. We got to be reasonable about this. This is not just, well, we're a good Catholic family, we're going to be exempt, or I'm a virtuous guy, or I got to pray more. It's like, no, you got to do practical things with something that can be physically damaging. If a lion jumps into the living room, you don't just kneel down and say, please make it go away. You get into the next room, you lock the door, and then you pray or whatever it is. That's what I mean as far as like that. So that's good clarification. Okay. All right. So not merely a vice, but merely in quotation marks. So, all right. So I guess if we can lay out that we have the neurological effects and how damaging they are and how can so easily become addictive. We do have the moral connotation because to really choose that sort of thing is going to break down a lot more inside of us as far as our virtue and our will and our principles of goodness and stuff like that than we might think perhaps. Now I want to kind of look at, let's take a step back and again, try and treat this even with a little bit more understanding. Okay. So, because if for someone that's never heard of this or never really thought about it too much, it might just sound, well, this is terrible. And how can anyone possibly, and at the same time, it is something that's definitely more an issue for a man than a woman. And many women have a very hard time understanding it as well, or ever, fostering trust or knowing what to do if their child stumbles on things like that. So just to understand, even at each level, man, woman, and children. So to start with the man, we do have to realize that this is definitely more prevalently an issue for men, although not restricted to. But why is it, mostly a male problem? It really comes down to because it's more a manipulation of their particular nature
Okay.
than, let's just say human nature that's shared between man and woman. It's so, man's particular human nature is designed by God to be the physical and active element. He's the builder, he's the protector, he's the leader, and he's been given those powers, let's say, by God to fulfill his role. So you take the kind of more like the physical aspect of a man, and these aren't just, I'm throwing them out as kind of like abstract terms, but they really are the way that we're wired.
Yeah, they're really sort of universal attributes that I think most people realize.
Different degrees of hormones and different ways that the brain interacts with things. So you take that more physical, active, external nature, and you put that up in front of something that is physical and pleasurable and very alluring and all that sort of thing. That's going to affect that particular type of nature a lot more. And in a way that doesn't even necessarily need to be as insidious as it sounds. For a man, the whole world is more of a physical orientation. And the ordering of that physical, aspect of himself, even when it just comes to, a young boy growing up and just learning to order his passions and things like that. I mean, that's in a sense, that's one of the basic ways that every man saves his soul, because it's that much a part of his life that he constantly has to be ordering things, whether that's looking away from things or denying himself things. And that's just very much part of the life, even just the internal life of a man. And I think that's hard for many women to understand, because they don't see it the same way. They're not affected by the visual in the same way. And many women would find it surprising, I think, even to know that, at any given day, a man, her husband might have made 30 heroic sacrifices, to himself to honor his wife, when it comes to just the immodesty in the world. Like it's a constant thing. And I think that surprises many women. But I'm pointing this out because, again, for a man to understand what he has to work on in order to, to order this particular temptation, but then also for a woman to understand where a man's coming from. It's important. It's not just that he's so evil or something like that, or that, something is irrevocably lost. It's just not that. A man is going to be more affected by this because his nature is more attuned to this sort of thing. Okay. And that's the reality. When it comes to, the nature of a woman, like I said, it's less likely to affect a woman, this particular thing. Although it could be said that, let's say, the more kind of like normal sense of pornography is less likely to affect a woman, whereas a different sense, more like the romantic or literary kind of form, could be more of a temptation for a woman, because now that's her particular nature given by God. So a woman's nature is more the passive and receptive element, but also the more personal element. It's not just, I don't need to build a house, a roof over this family. I need to take care of these individual people. Like the woman is designed by God to see the person underneath the externals. And so her nature can be manipulated by this whole thing as well, but definitely not in the same way. Not in the way that just kind of leads to just concrete sin.
Sure. Okay.
But I would say that there's something that is difficult for a man to understand about a woman, as far as all that goes, and for a woman maybe to have to address in herself, is that this whole issue, it really does go far beyond just people committing sins, looking at things or acting on things. It really is something that trickles out into our culture. And so I think we can understand what I mean when I say that, there's a pornographic spirit that can be kind of imbibed, and that's something that can affect a woman a lot more than might be realized. And I don't mean kind of the obvious sense is that, like, the objectification of a woman that most people get. That's a result of pornography. It just turns a woman to an object, and we get that, like that. Yeah. And it could have its effect, especially if a woman has no moral upbringing, things like that. Okay, then becoming an object might seem irrelevant enough good. But it's more, I would say, the more relevant issue is kind of just this passivity of the pornographic culture that kind of brings this mindset with it that does affect many women, that it's not total objectification, but it's a lack of self-respect. It's a lack of realizing, where where they are meant to be significant. So let's say the particular difficulty for a woman is, a desire to be significant, but maybe in the wrong way. So, the nature of a woman is significant. She's meant to be the temple of life, and she's going to be, as a mother, the first contact that a new soul has with goodness and truth and beauty, which is, the foundation for its knowledge of God. I mean, that's a very significant thing. It's a beautiful thing, what God created a mother to be. But in there is the point. A woman is supposed to be, as a mother, a channel to the higher being, to God. And if she takes her abilities, her beauty, her nature, and draws that, attraction to herself as the end, now that's the problem. That's what I mean by sort of like this passive pornographic spirit, not in the most brutal sense of the term, but it's something that affects, and you see it. I mean, today a lot of young women are very, very low on self-esteem, and at the same time, they're kind of being sucked into this culture of immodesty and basic, sexual attraction, because they're trying to respond to this need and bring this attraction to themselves as a substitute for love and affection, whatever it is. But all that really, what that does in the end is that it's this spirit of bringing an attention to me instead of me leading someone higher. Okay. So that could be a whole lifelong battle for a woman. And that's, something that a man doesn't usually think of. So my point is that we, on both sides, there are difficult things that have to be addressed and difficult things that have to be understood and difficult things that have to be worked on. And both of them in their own respective places are something that, like I said, can be, really someone's work of their salvation, if you work on that. But something really worth realizing and to get that understanding kind of part into it. And then lastly, because you have the nature of a man, you have the nature of a woman, and then abstractly you have the nature of a child. And this is where pornography is, in my opinion, just the most insidious thing to be imagined in our modern day. So the problem is that a child, even if they don't have any realization of their sexual nature, they don't have any ideas about it, even, they're very young, they don't understand the concept, even if their body is not fully developed, they are still human beings. And so that they still have the elements of all of this nature within themselves, and it can easily just as well be manipulated. So this is, that's the reality, let's say, of child abuse, of sexual abuse of a minor. It's a manipulation of their sexual nature, and the reason it is so damaging is because it brings with it that whole scope of the physicality of sexuality that's affecting their mind. It carves grooves into their neurological pathways right away. It opens up channels in their hormonal system that otherwise wouldn't have. It manipulates their whole physical nature, which in turn affects, how they think about themselves, how they see the world, how they see relationships, how they see trust and love and all that sort of thing. So it's a terrible, terrible wound that comes with it. And that's, we get that, or at least we should try and get that, just to realize like how awful that it is. Well, quite simply speaking, pornography is the same thing. It is sexual abuse of children. It has the same effects as if there's an actual person causing these wounds in the children, because it brings with it all the same physicality. So it might be that it's just a screen, but you still have someone who is, an intentional manipulator. You still have an element of trust, because just like all of us, we have this sort of naivety, this simple, like, well, it's, we're not expecting to act against the screen. And especially a child isn't. So there's an element of trust, which is part of the element of abuse. And then it's a manipulation of their sexual nature. And it brings all those wounds with it, that whole changing of their psychology. And so because it exploits, their sexual nature, it does have the same effects on their body and brain as if from a person, like I said. A child's brain in contact with pornography can become instantly hijacked. And it's far beyond anything that they can control. And that's something we have to understand about children. It doesn't take a bad kid to get caught up in this thing. It doesn't take a bad kid to to even become addicted to it. Unfortunately, if that were a possibility to them, all it takes is a child and a screen because of how powerful it is. So an example, like it doesn't take a bad kid if someone were to insidiously give a child a big old strong cocktail, an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
They would be completely drunk, completely unable to, to make their own choices and act and stuff like that. Well, to illustrate this with a story, to compare it with impure content, there's I mentioned a couple before. There's a website called Protect Young Eyes, which has a lot of resources to help parents with these sort of things. And they posted a story once that a parent sent in, where the parents were mortified to discover that their 10-year-old was looking at pornography. And they were, we're a good Christian family. How could this possibly happen? We thought you raised you right. And, they tried to, they sat down with the kid and they did the best they could, don't freak out and all that sort of thing. But son, how could you do this? We've trained you to, and the child said to his parents, I'm sorry, I couldn't stop clicking. I just couldn't stop. Like it was as if he lost control, and that's exactly what happened. So the whole flood of hormones and the effect of the pleasure receptors and all that sort of thing, what that does to a child's brain, it's as if you just gave them a triple shot drink, and they've lost the ability to choose. So that's terrifying, because it's not just that they could be affected by that and maybe be so ashamed that they might not be able to talk to you about it. I mean, we're going to, we have to really hit those points.
Sure.
But the problem is that, this could very well be a lifelong thing. It could be something that affects, in a sense, how they think about sexuality in general, just their first contact with it. How they're going to grow up, what particular temptations or even disordered tendencies they might have to deal with, all that sort of thing. And then again, it's going to affect, their possibility of vocation and way of life. And
so again, this parallel of abuse and pornography isn't even so much a parallel. You're saying
it's the same thing.
It's a species of the same thing.
It's a species of the same thing. Yeah. And I actually had a conversation with the guy that runs that website, an email back and forth. I said, because he does a lot for trying to lobbying for laws in different states to restrict things, and he's doing a lot of good work. And but I asked him, I was like, this whole thing with pornography and sexual abuse, how is this not clearly illegal?
Yeah.
And he responded right. It was like, well, money. Yeah, it's money. So we go back to $97 billion a year made by the pornography industry. Last year, it's okay. Well, it's a battle that is far from being won when it comes to just things being available. And maybe it kind of a part, something that's adding to this problem is that there's kind of a mirroring of what's happening in culture that happens in an individual's brain. So to get to the point where someone is intentionally looking up something explicitly impure, and then acting upon it, let's say, is to get to that point, they've had to break down a series of barriers, like kind of moral barriers, natural law barriers, in themselves to really get to that actual explicitness. Well, in our culture, those barriers are, decade after decade being broken down for us. So the manner of dress and the way that a woman is legitimately objectified, even just on, kids shows now, it's becoming more and more something that we're just used to the point where I think many parents don't bat an eye if, the cartoon character is, wearing something less than normal day clothing, or even just like the normal shows where the girls are in whatever, short shorts and stuff. That's become the norm to us, and it shouldn't be, because what that's doing is that before a child even realizes the morality of anything good or bad or anything that has to do with it, those barriers have already been broken down for him. And that's a terrible thing, and that's something that is kind of a more hidden and subtle problem, but something that has to be thought about and talked about by parents. But even I guess my point is going back to this, this question of sexual abuse, is that all pornography should be illegal, basically.
Clearly.
Or at the very least, if we're living in an atheistic country, an agnostic country that still believes that the sexual abuse of children is wrong, well, then it should at least be absolutely restricted because of what it can do to child that, actively finds something once. But my point is that problem is not only not going to go away, like the battle to try and make that illegal and to actually try and restrict it when we're talking about 2/3 of internet downloads. Not only is that not going to go away, but more and more this reality is going to become the norm. What I mean is
is it safe to say it is the norm? I mean,
norm in the sense of acceptable.
Oh, I see.
So norm in the sense of, right now, in the past 2 decades, let's say, pornography went from something that, someone really had to intentionally want and go to that particular type of store. And it was kind of looked, even from an agnostic society, more or less looked down on as something perverted, to basically universally accepted and celebrated. I mean, it is. And now, the only thing that's illegal in any of it is child pornography. And that's so that right now society, by and large, and even the legislature says that's wrong. You can't do that. That's illegal. But my point is, like, how much longer will that actually even be the case? One might ask, if things have gone this bad, and, the reality of sexual abuse in our day and age is just becoming increasingly worse, that's not going to slow down with our with our pornographic culture, especially since it's in the kids shows, it's in the entertainment, it's in the social media, and no one's even realizing it because we've been conditioned to accept that level of barrier breakdown. Okay. And so is there any real hope that this terrible thing can be regulated, or the people? Probably not. Yeah, probably not. It's going to come down to what are we going to do about it, in our own families. But so, I can't make the point enough that the addictive effects, let's say, to kind of sum up everything that we've said so far, I can't make the point enough that the addictive effects of pornography, they can't be overemphasized. We have to be terrified of it. If we think about the possibility of a 12-year-old boy, maybe even being definitively blocked from pursuing a religious vocation just because someone carelessly left an unlocked phone around the house. That's easily possible. That's the sort of thing that we have to be terrified of and be like, okay, how am I going to very proactively fight this? Because it can be fought, and there can be a lot of practical things that can be done to really safeguard children, and then eventually, I think we're going to talk a lot more just about kids and technology and kind of how that all works together. I wasn't meaning to plan on getting into it so much this time around, but a lot of that's going to come down to just a proactive building of trust. And really, that's going to be, I could already tell you right now, that's going to be the main thing as far as what can I do to help my children with this. It's proactively building trust with them, because it's basically impossible to prevent them from at least stumbling on something, whether that's in Walmart or on something that pops them on the internet. The difference between them having a lifelong struggle with it and the difference between the lifelong struggle and the normal, let's say, growth in human nature and growing from your mistakes is going to be what happens next after that initial step. If they turn into shame and secrecy, and then obsession, okay, there goes the lifelong struggle. But if they go to mom or dad and say, hey, I saw this, and mom or dad,
what do I do?
Responds well, boom, that's all the difference. Yeah. So can't overemphasize, I think, the addictive effects, because then children aside, let's say, just to come back to the general thing, is that we all have to realize that we are all prey to this. We are all susceptible to this particular temptation, not necessarily in our will, but in our nature, and we do have to proactively fight against it, because if we're not careful, the little barriers that break down in our own world, just the movies we watch or the music we listen to or the things that we read, that is going to dispose us more and more to have to fight this reality that is physically stronger than our capability of saying no to it. Which we don't like that idea, you know. It sounds like, what are you saying? I don't have free will anymore. Well, in a sense, I mean, but at the same, like, it's not crazy to say that something physical is physically stronger than you. If you get in a wrestling match with a gorilla, you're gonna lose. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care how badly you want it, and I don't even care how many rosaries you've said. You're gonna lose. You know, like, he's physically stronger than you. Well, how do you win it? You don't get in that. You don't get in the ring. But so my point is, you know, back to kind of the first point of it being, you know, a neurological thing for mostly, in quotation marks. That means that in the conclusion, it cannot be overcome simply by willpower or simply, quote unquote, by prayer and the sacraments. We have to dispose ourselves in order for those things to be able to work in us, for Christ's strength to be able to supplement for our weakness. But that the things that we have to do to supplement that's going to be our practicality. It simply can't be overcome by just wanting to more or praying. It has to be practical abstinence. It has to be even sometimes therapeutic methods, where you know, whether that's with someone's help or just on your own. Certainly has to be aided by prayer. But it all is going to just come down to anyone making the practical choice of denying themselves access to these things in the first place, especially if it's ever been a particular temptation. And then all of us, without exception, making the practical disposition that arranges our life to just say, I'm not going to get any closer to this than I have to. Yeah, because it's a terrible, terrible problem. So that's, we have a lot more, I think, that we can talk about, and I think we will, without going too long in one time through. Because what I do definitely want to talk about is I want to talk about, you know, what someone can do, both preventatively and positively, you know, to get out of something or to help someone else. There's a lot of things to be talked about there. And then, like I said, I hope we can, you know, talk about, especially, you know, as far as helping our children and how to approach that.
Father, you've given us a lot to chew on, and I know we're going to do future episodes on practical things and what can be done to help, tools for parents and oneself. But can you give us, maybe by way of conclusion, just the moral viewpoint, right? The general moral conclusion.
Sure. And again, just like we talked about with social media, I'm not, you know, making a magisterial teaching here. It's more just, it's a pretty simple comparison of moral principles that the church had always taught and the problem at hand. So we're talking about something that is gravely damaging to souls on pretty much every level, and having unnecessary contact with that or risk of contact with that is, you know, that's already going to be a problem in itself. So if I were to just kind of lay out a few principles, the first would be for anyone having just totally unfiltered internet without any accountability, you know, on your own private smartphone. At the very least, that's imprudent. I'm not saying that it's going to be, you know, someone's absolutely committing a sin. But at the very least, it's imprudent, and to willfully keep ourselves in a state of just imprudence, that's going to quickly become immoral. At least on some level. Now, one step up from that, or down, however you want to look at it, is that even if once or twice a device, someone's personal device, has been intentionally used for explicit material, so they've succumbed to the temptation in an intentional way, continuing to have that device and have it unfiltered, you know, like, and we're going to talk a lot about what that means, because it's not just I got a free app and it's going to filter things, options. But so to really, you know, to work on my digital technology so that to the best of my ability to know and judge, I don't have access to something, even if, quote unquote, I would have wanted to, sort of thing. That's where it needs to be, to continue to have our devices outside of that state. If someone has intentionally used it for something explicit, that is gravely sinful, because that's the definition of putting ourselves in an unnecessary occasion of grave sin, especially, so not only unnecessary, but likely, because we're the whole addictive thing. So that's on a personal level. It's gravely sinful for someone to persist in the use of something that is a near occasion of sin. And it's simply not enough, like I said, to just say, well, I'm going to try really hard. Like it doesn't work like that. Well, when it comes to something like this. And then lastly, something for families, I guess, or like parents, you know, kind of the same thing, to allow children to have access to devices without, you know, at least very strict filtering, accountability, strict vigilance, all of that because of the possibility of the serious and grave harm that could happen to a child, that also has to be stated to be gravely sinful, mortally sinful as a sin of neglect on the part of the parents. And obviously I'm saying, insofar as, we realize these things, and that's why we're talking about it. And so I don't want, someone to, be like, oh my gosh, I had no idea any of this was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So fine. Now, well, you got to change is the point. Yes. But yeah, so those are I think the moral conclusions, and then, we can build off into practicality next time we talk, I guess.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Father. That'll be the next episode, I think. Practical tools, things to help, some signs of hope or tools of hope that we can all use to fight against these things. So thank you very much, Father.
Thanks.